It's Richard again, and we're back in the shop, and as you can see, the high mark fender flares are on. If you haven't seen the installation, check out the other videos I have on that. But this is all to make clearance for the 35-inch tires, and those are still on their way. With that said, though, we have one other suspension upgrade to make, and guess what? The King shocks are in. So let's take a look. Here we go. This is the Colorado setup for the King shock offering. These happen to be the adjustable variants so that we can play with the firmness with a single click adjustment. They are delivered in their original form here in the softest setting, so each click will get them firmer. We're going to leave those in the softest setting until we get everything on the car and do some time with the suspension to figure things out. There is a full hardware kit. This is mainly for the parts to mount the remote reservoirs, and there are those perch mounts that go up on top. We do have some spacers for the ZR2 sway bar, of course the instruction book, and of course some information on how to adjust coilovers, removing the load in that. We'll see if we even need to do that. I'm assuming, again, with the original setting, I should be just fine. The rears, we are looking at a remote reservoir, and this is one of the piggyback shocks. There is no hoses on these. So this will be what the installation will entail today. We'll get started here on the front in just 1 minute. Before we get too far ahead, one of the first things you're going to want to do with any kind of suspension mod that might adjust ride height, or you may have some adjustability in ride height, you're going to want to take a baseline. So I'm going to start off here, find the center line of the wheel, find a common mark point here. It's great with the high marks. We do have a bolt that's right there, so I can kind of plumb and center my measurement and take my initial numbers. I'm going to want to do that with each of the different wheels, and of course there might be small variations from one to the other. That is normal, of course, as we weight the vehicle down. I do have a half tank of gas, I do have some gear in the back, so the numbers may vary, and what we're going to look for is to see a consistent change in that when we do replace the front coilovers. If there is a discrepancy, of course the coilovers are adjustable, and that's something we're going to take a note of and of course adjust as we need. So here's what all the measurements turned out being. The front passengers at 38.5, the front driver is also at 38.5, and there might be about a 1/16 of an inch of bias there from side to side. The rear passengers at 39.75, as well as the rear driver at 39.75. So overall, the stock setup that I have right now has a bit of a rake. The front end is actually higher in measurement. It's simply because the high mark fender flares do sit higher in the front for more clearance. But if you look at the frame, the front is slightly lower, having about a 3/4 to 7/8 inch rake from front to rear. This is what we're working with, so we'll keep this in mind when we do our measurements after we get the King coilovers put in. Now it's time to get the shocks removed so that we can do the installation in the rear, and I'm going to start with the passenger side rear and take loose the main lower shock bolt, and there's a nut on the other side, and I'll do the same for the driver's side and get that bolt loose, and then remove that so we can take the entire shock assembly out. You might notice that the bolt has a little bit of tension on it, and as you can see here, I'm putting a little bit of pressure and using the threads to drive it out. Basically, the rear end is capable of going lower than the actual shock, and as you'll see, once the bolt comes out, the rear end will drop a little further. The shock, in fact, is the limiter on overall suspension. After the bottom is completely loose, it's pretty simple. There's no nut at the top. These are threaded into the frame with a welded nut. Basically use our same impact gun here to remove the upper, and then just wiggle side to side and you can remove the DSSV assemblies. With the driver's side done, we're going to do the same thing over here at the passenger side. It is a little bit more difficult to get to as this is a forward-facing shock, so you will be above the exhaust system, and in this case I do have our Overland Series exhaust here, but still it's a straight shot using the impact and an extension to get to the top bolt, and remember there's no nut, it is actually welded into the frame. Now that we have the DSSV out of the vehicle, we can compare it side by side to the King and look at some of the quick differences in the physical design. The first thing you'll notice is the DSSV does have a thinner shock shaft, and the thicker shock shaft of the King is going to net a little bit more strength. Ultimately, these have to have similar designs. They have eyelets at the bottom, they have a housing, and then at the top you're going to see a similar eyelet. That is all a function of what has to fit in the vehicle. But here the biggest difference is, of course, the spool valve technology of the Multimatic versus the piggyback and the larger piston, larger volume capacity, and the tuning of the King. Now these are two different technologies and they work very differently. I'm not going to contrast those yet. There's tons of videos on that content, but this is what they look like. In comparing the overall length eyelet to eyelet of the King shock versus the DSSV, you're going to see that the eyelet to eyelet measurement is identical, so the overall length is the same, meaning that the overall travel from the two shouldn't be any different. That should be the case, as this is a direct fit replacement application. Getting back to the installation, we're ready to take the piggyback King and place it back in position. I am going to start with the passenger side, and basically here, the one thing you're going to want to take a look at is when you install the King, the reservoir is on the back side towards the back of the vehicle. Also, you're going to find that there's a spacer difference, and I'll show you a close-up here on the driver's side shock, but there is an offset to move the shock further away from the chassis side, and you'll see that same offset on the bottom eyelet. Again, I'll do a detail shot for you as we go to the passenger side here, and this is where you'll see that offset. So the side that's closest to the inside is going to have a short spacer. The spacer on the longest side is going to be towards the outside of the vehicle. In placing the driver's side, we're going to use the same technique to place it in the upper eyelet and then place it in the bottom. But again, the process is to make sure that that spacer is towards the frame rail on both the top and bottom on both sides. With the shock held in place with the bolt, I'm going to now run that bolt up with the impact, and I'm not going to use the impact to tighten it all the way down, as I will save that for the torque wrench. I am going to apply the manufacturer's recommended spec for the bolt to make sure that the bolt isn't over tightened. This does have that weld-in nut in the frame, so over tightening it can break that loose or potentially damage the threads on the bolt. So just make sure if you're going to use some kind of an impact device, you're not running it all the way through, that you do use a torque wrench applied with the proper torque spec to make sure that the bolt is tight enough but not over tightened. Now we have to lower the weight of the vehicle onto the spring so that we can get the shock lower eyelet to line up to the axle housing bolt holes. In this case, I'm just simply going to lower the lift and allow the weight of the vehicle on the spring to compress it. But if you're on a jack and jack stand, you can do the same by jacking up the axle and putting pressure on that spring. Once the two are lined up, basically push your bolt through, and next up you're going to see me use the impact to run the nut on the other side. It's just a matter of convenience and time. I don't like to use the impact to tighten these or over tighten these, so the next step will be to look it up in the manual and get the proper torque spec, and using the torque wrench apply the proper torque so as not to damage the hardware that we're using from the stock installation. We will repeat this exact same process on the other side for the passenger side shock. So the first thing I'm going to talk about here is what's different from a stock ZR2. This particular vehicle has the Camberg upper control arm, and the Camberg upper control arm is still a prototype and it may not be out by the time this video is made. However, it's a uniball setup with Heims. While it has some differences in geometry, it still comes apart basically the same with the two main bolts and such, and we'll see that when I get into details there. The coilover itself, you'll notice, has a different spring. This has the Eibach Pro Lift kit on it, so it's a leveling kit on the factory DSSV, and this will look identical to the factory setup minus a little bit higher spring rate and, of course, a different height spring. So the first step in removing the DSSV coilover is to remove the top mounting bolts. And in this case, the stock unit actually uses 3 nuts. These are 18 millimeter. And as you can see, I'm using a ratcheting boxed-in wrench. This will be the best way to remove them, gives you the most clearance to manipulate them. Typically, I like to work on the one that's hardest to get first, which is the one in the back, and then work my way around to the two front. The front ones are much easier to get to, but again, that boxed-in ratcheting wrench will be the key to getting this off with the least amount of effort. Now we're going to remove a couple of parts that are attached to the knuckle and one to the frame. The first one here is the wheel speed sensor. This is used for obviously calculating the wheel speed for everything from traction control to the ABS braking system. And this is a fragile line as it's mounted here to the back of the knuckle. We do want to release that so that when we do take that upper ball joint loose on a stock one, or in this case the uniball loose, we're not going to pull on that. And the second thing we're going to work on is the bracket that mounts the soft line from the brake caliper to the frame, to the hard line that's on the frame. Loosening this up will simply allow the hard line to unsnap from the retainer and make sure that when we pull that, again, upper ball joint or the uniball here down, it's not going to pull on that rubber hose and cause any damage at the joint. Next up, we have to separate that ball joint on the outer tie rod. So I'm going to take the nut loose here, and there's a couple different ways to treat it once you're done. You're going to see me thread that back down partially to protect the threads on the ball joint. and strike it directly with a hammer. You could also strike the outside edge of the knuckle body to loosen it up, and that's another way to do it so as not to damage the threads. Next up, we have the lower coilover mount bolts. We have two 15mm here, and when you get the second one out, realize that you're going to get a little bit of suspension movement. There's a little extra droop as the shock assembly is the limiter for down travel. The next step will vary if you don't have an upper control arm with a uniball upper. This will be where you're going to want to separate that upper ball joint, and in a stock ZR2, basically you're going to take the bolt that comes through the bottom end of the knuckle up into the ball joint, remove that, and then strike the end of the body to loosen it. In my case, I am using a uniball, so I will have to hold the bolt at the top while I'm loosening the nut at the bottom. Now that we can separate the uniball or the ball joint, we can push the upper control arm out of the way. In the case of using this kind of a Heim joint upper control arm, it actually moves up quite easily and will stay in position. If you've got the stock upper control arm, you might have a little bit of bind in the bushings, and that'll prevent you from pushing it up out of the way this far, but you only have to move it up a little bit to get the coilover assembly out. To remove the coilover assembly, I'm going to allow the jack to come completely down. I basically had that underneath there just to make sure that we weren't pulling on any of the parts, whether it be the ABS line, the brake line, or the CV joint. Let that down completely so we can lightly twist the bottom of the DSSV to avoid any of the obstructions from the tie rod to the sway bar, and just kind of thread it out the bottom. And that's pretty much it for the removal. Now that we have the DSSV out, we can lay it side by side with the King and compare some of the physical attributes. I'm not going to go into all the details of the differences here, but there are some very obvious ones with regards to the reservoir size, the reservoir location, and here you can see the Kings at the top and the Multimatic DSSVs at the bottom. There are some key differences though, as the position-sensitive spool dampening valves are a different kind of technology, have different needs than something that's a traditional race shock, which is a higher volume unit that can sustain more up and down travel before boiling over any of the fluids inside. Now, again, the adjustability is something that's unique, and the rebuildability, the DSSV, as you can see here, is for the most part a non-rebuildable assembly and is set as it is stock. Taking a look further, you can see also that the body size is a little different. The DSSV is a smaller diameter body. The 2.5 of the King is notably larger. That holds more volume. It also makes a larger piston that travels up and down the shock body. You can't really see it here, but inside of this boot, you can see that there's a smaller shaft. It's actually the same size as what's in the rear, and what you can see here in the King is a larger shock shaft. That's going to handle more load, and that's sort of to be expected on something that's derived of more of a race-proven design. Very different shocks, but just a moment here to kind of take a look at what the differences are physically. One other thing to note about the physical attributes of the shock is the King measures in at 23 1/8, and the DSSV comes in at 22 5/8. That small difference will net a little bit more droop out of the King shock. Now it's time for the shock assembly to be installed, but we want to make sure we put the right shock assembly on the right side, so pay attention to the instruction guide and looking at where the hoses exit towards. And also, when we're talking about hoses here, just be very careful if you're handling the hose or any of the fittings. We don't want to use those as leverage points. We're trying to bear all the weight here at the bottom and just guide the hose up at the top, because we can damage the hose or the fitting if we use it to actually force the shock into position. Now that we have that position basically set the way we want to, we're going to put the bolts in that are supplied in the King kit, put the washer and the nut down, and we're going to do the same for both sides of the lower mount. Now, before we mount the upper control arm to the knuckle, we're going to make sure that we feed the reservoir through the middle of the control arm and just leave it to the side for now. We can continue with the rest of the upper control arm mount. Again, make note here, I do have that uniball upper joint. If you have a ball joint, you're going to reassemble the ball joint here, put the nut on the bottom of the ball joint. In this case here, you're going to watch the uniball go back together in a slightly different fashion. Now we're ready to install the reservoir mount, and this goes on top of the perch assembly, and slightly different than the original stock one, we don't have studs passing through from the coilover to a nut on the top. We're actually mounting this on top of the perch, and we have a bolt that's supplied in the kit that passes through the mount, through the perch, and into the coilover assembly. We're going to want to get all three of those in there, and this does have slots so you can get the exact positioning. And speaking of positioning, you're going to want to refer back to the manual quickly here and make sure that those upper brackets are mounted correctly. There will be a diagram that shows how the bracket itself is offset. The mounting portion of that in the back is slightly biased towards the bottom to make sure the reservoir is mounted all the way into its utmost top position. And once we have that in place, we're ready to affix that reservoir into its final position. King does provide an extra set of stickers for the logo, and in my case, they were slightly rotated the wrong direction, so I went ahead and reaffixed those to put them in a proper viewing position from the outside of the vehicle. Here we're going to use those worm gear clamps, feed it through, and there's a slot in the back of this bracket to keep the alignment correct. Move it down into the lower position and just snug these up. Don't apply too much pressure, but just enough to hold the upper reservoir in place. Next up, we have to move on to the sway bar relocation, and inside of the King kit, they do provide you with a block assembly that will move the sway bar down and forward. There's two 10 millimeters here that we'll have to loosen up, and if for some reason you can't get it pulled down far enough, you're gonna have to go to the other side, maybe loosen one of those bolts. When we go to put the block in, make sure you get the orientation right. It actually will not install incorrectly, but now we're going to reuse those factory bolts and install that block with the two parts we had just taken out. Once that's in place, we're going to use the two new supplied bolts from King and place the factory mount for the bushing back over the new relocation block. And here's a quick recap of how things should look. With the block installed from the passenger side, looking from the outside of the fender in, the block should lower the sway bar down and move it forward. And now looking at the reservoir, we want to make sure that those worm gears are tight in pulling the body against that mount. And also when we're looking straight at the mount, the reservoir should be in its highest position, touching the inner fender, and should set above that perch when looking from the outside in. And there we have it. This is what the final installation should look like, minus the fact I haven't put in the sway bar link from the lower control arm into the sway bar eyelet. I do have to finish up the other side here. So it's time to just double check all the nuts and bolts we have here, make sure everything is torqued to the proper specification. And now we're ready to get everything on the ground where we can make our adjustments to the firmer or softer settings. And more importantly, just get everything where we can measure and make sure that we're ready to get out on the road and do some final testing. So here's the finished look. With everything installed, it's actually got a leveled look. And that's something that I thought was where it should be, but I've had some issues in the back end, which was resolved at the dealership. I had some leaky DSSVs. Those did go out at about 26,000 miles. I had those replaced, and then really I was hoping that that would be part of the ride quality problem, but the rear springs kind of lost some of that spring tension and arc, and we're riding on the secondaries or the overload spring, and the ride quality was gone, but it also had diminished some of the ride height. I had just got those rears replaced, and let's take a look at the rear spring pack. Is actually brand new as well. It is just a stock ZR2, but it brought the ride height up almost 7/8 of an inch from where it was with what I thought was partly some of the issues with the DSSV, and additionally when the DSSVs failed, that load control was gone and it really just took the spring out of the rear springs. With the spring back, I got some good ride height, and as you step back, you can see the truck is very level. The measurements indicate that there is about 1 centimeter difference in the arch, but the truck, for as far as frame to ground, is very level. And again, here is all the work put into it. The upper mount area also houses the bracket for the reservoir. Everything tucks nice and neatly away. Basically, all the fitment is as it should be. There is that spacer we had to put in the sway bar. That's how that looks there, and that just helps with the clearance in the front. It moves the sway bar forward a bit and down. Additionally, I think I may invest in some new brake lines and get some stainless brake lines on this. These do go right to the maximum. Not necessarily worried about it, but it could use a little bit of better brake feel as well. But there you are. Kings in the front and Kings in the back. Now it's time to go test it out and see how that ride quality is.